You open your phone, out of habit. Scroll for a second. Stop at an old conversation. You don't open it. You just look at the name. And then you say it. I miss them. It sounds right. It sounds honest. It sounds like the only explanation that makes sense. Something ended. Someone left. And what remains must be longing. That's the story your mind gives you because it's simple and it protects you. Because I miss them is a clean sentence. It keeps everything outside of you. It keeps the loss focused on a person, not on what changed inside you when they were there and when they left. And most people never go beyond that sentence. They say it, they feel it, and they move on. But stay there for a second longer than you normally would. Don't go to the explanation yet. Don't complete the story. Just look at what the feeling is actually doing. Because the mind doesn't give you the truth first. It gives you the version that feels easiest to carry. And missing someone is one of the easiest emotional labels there is. It sounds real. It sounds human. It even sounds a little bit noble. It lets you believe that what you had meant something, that you were someone who felt deeply. And the mind protects stories that make you look like that. It doesn't rush to complicate them. So instead of questioning the feeling, you start building around it. You remember things, not everything, just the parts that fit. The conversations that flowed without effort. The routines that formed without anyone planning them. The version of yourself that didn't feel like it had to constantly adjust or explain. You remember the ease. You remember the familiarity. You remember how certain everything felt when you didn't have to question where you stood. And those memories start to repeat. And repetition turns them into something stable, something that feels complete. But the brain doesn't remember the past accurately. It remembers it efficiently. It edits. It cuts friction. It lowers the volume on what didn't fit and turns up the volume on what did. Moments that once felt confusing become vague. Tension becomes background noise. Patterns you noticed at the time slowly disappear. What you're left with is not a lie, but it's not the full picture either. It's a version that is easier to sit with, a version that doesn't argue back. That's the part people don't notice. The memory you're holding no longer resists you. It doesn't interrupt you. It doesn't correct you. It just sits there, shaped in a way that supports the feeling. So of course it feels natural to say you miss them. There's nothing in that version pushing against the idea. But reality always had resistance. There were moments that didn't fit, conversations that felt slightly off, times where you had to adjust yourself just enough to keep things steady. You remember less of those, not because they didn't matter, but because they were inconvenient. So when you say, I miss them, what you're often holding isn't the person as they were. It's the version of the experience that no longer pushes back, a version that doesn't disappoint you, doesn't complicate things, doesn't require you to deal with the parts that didn't work. It just exists the way you need it to exist. Quiet, edited, stable. Look at the feeling more closely, not the words, the actual pull underneath it. What are you reaching for? Do you miss them, or do you miss how you felt when things were working? Do you miss them, or do you miss the version of yourself that existed around them? The one who felt chosen, the one who didn't have to analyze every interaction, the one who felt like they had a place without having to prove it every day. Because those are not the same thing. And most of the time, people don't separate them. Sometimes what feels like longing is just the absence of that version of you, a version that had structure, a version that had direction, a version that made sense inside someone else's life. And when that disappears, the mind needs a label. It doesn't say, "I miss who I was." It says, "I miss them," because that's easier to accept. But if you really miss them, you would miss all of it. Not just the warm parts, not just the easy moments. You would miss the tension, the uncertainty, the parts where things didn't quite align, the parts where you hesitated, the parts where something felt slightly off and you ignored it because everything else was still holding together. And most of the time, you don't miss those parts. You miss something cleaner than what actually existed. There's another layer underneath this that most people avoid. The version of the future you had in your head. The direction things seemed to be going. The conversations you assumed you would still be having. The version of the ending that never got a chance to exist. That doesn't disappear cleanly when something ends. It stays open, and the mind doesn't like open loops. It keeps returning to them. It replays moments. It fills in what never happened. It tries to complete something that no longer exists in a form you can touch. That loop starts to feel like missing someone. But what you're actually holding on to isn't always the person. It's the unfinished version of the story. The version that never resolved itself. The version that never proved whether it would work or fall apart. It just stopped. And unfinished things have weight. They stay active. They keep pulling you back. So what you're feeling isn't always the loss of a person. It's the loss of a structure, a version of time that felt stable, a version of yourself that only made sense inside that connection. And that version doesn't come back. Not because they're gone, but because you're not the same person anymore. That's the part most people don't want to look at, because it changes the story. It stops being about them and starts being about what you lost in yourself when that ended. And that's harder to carry. So the mind simplifies it again. It compresses everything into one sentence that feels complete. I miss them. But if you slow it down, even for a moment, you can feel that the sentence doesn't fully match the feeling underneath it. There's more there. Something less clean. Something less comfortable. So the next time that thought shows up, don't go to the words immediately. Don't go to the explanation. Just stay with the first reaction for a second longer than you normally would. What are you actually reaching for? The person? Or the version of you that existed when they were still there? Because those are not the same thing. And once you see the difference, you can't call it the same thing anymore.